was anti-American energy policies. Those are the things that Senate Democrats voted for repeatedly and stood behind and supported. Republicans are focused on making life more affordable for families all across this country, hardworking families. And we have a plan to unleash American energy. And that way, we can keep lowering prices for American families. I just can never forget when Joe Biden said he wanted to prioritize climate over energy that was available, affordable, and reliable. It was a disaster for the country and resulted in defeat of the Democrats. Today, Mr. President, I come to the floor also to talk about confirmation votes. And the Senate will soon vote on the confirmation of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. America needs to be healthy. I'm a doctor, worked with patients for over 20 years, as a surgeon in Wyoming. The problem is our nation faces a chronic disease epidemic. Chronic diseases, including diabetes, cancer, obesity, heart disease, high blood pressure, chronic diseases. They are so widespread that managing them accounts for almost 90% of the federal health care spending in this country. And we spend a lot of our gross national product on health care. Nearly 3 in 5 Americans, adults, and 1 in 4 American children are impacted by this. Our health care system tries to address the problem, but yet by incentivizing procedures over prevention and paying for that, well, it often fails to address what we need to do effectively as well as economically. As a result, Americans are actually becoming less healthy. We need to put America on the path to good health. President Trump has selected Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to do just that, to make America healthy again. Mr. Kennedy will bring a fresh set of ideas and eyes to important debates surrounding our nation's public health. He's going to be a voice for the vast number of Americans who were failed by the previous administration. The previous administration silenced reasoned debate. I believe that Mr. Kennedy is going to deliver accountability and transparency. For Americans, that means more choices and better information. It means healthy foods and healthy competition for patients. It means lower costs and higher quality. It means increased access to care. Access is so critical in my home state of Wyoming, with so many rural and frontier communities, people long distances from health care. It also means honest, unbiased, and trustworthy scientific research that is both innovative as well as accountable to the American people. People want the truth. They want to know what the facts are. They want to make their decisions then for themselves. Look, this is Mr. Kennedy's bold vision to revitalize America's Bill of Health. He's very clear about his mission, has been throughout. The mission, as he told the Finance Committee, is to end the chronic disease epidemic and make America healthy again. Apparently, that's not enough for the Senate Democrats. Senator Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada, she was actually dismissive of him at the Senate Finance Committee. I heard her say to Mr. Kennedy, "So that's the only reason why you're at HHS, to address this one issue?" This one issue, chronic disease epidemic that is plaguing our nation, is the key issue to our health care. Respectfully, addressing chronic disease is what we ought to be talking about for health care for the people of our country. You know, Mr. Kennedy had to testify and did testify before 2 separate Senate committees as part of his confirmation. Most people being confirmed and coming to the Senate only testify at one committee. He responded to rigorous questions from both Republicans and Democrats, and he answered those questions with candor and with clarity. He told the Senate Help Committee that his leadership approach was collaborative. He pledged to empower the scientists to do their jobs, not to impose, as he said, preordained opinions on anybody at HHS. He was also clear that he supports vaccines. He told the Finance Committee, I support the measles vaccine. I support the polio vaccine. I will do nothing as HHS Secretary, he said, that makes it difficult or discourages people from taking those vaccines. The Senate has every reason to take him at his word. Mr. Kennedy is a bold choice. He is pro-health, pro-vaccine, and pro-transparency. He's the right choice to make America healthy again. I look forward to voting to confirm him. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Virginia.
I ask unanimous consent that I be permitted to speak for 6 minutes, followed by Senator Wyden for 5 minutes, Senator Crapo for 5 minutes, and Senator Schumer for 2 minutes prior to the scheduled vote.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, I rise once more to oppose the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard to be the Director of National Intelligence. As I've said repeatedly, I have great respect for Ms. Gabbard's over 20 years of service to our nation, both in and out of uniform. I am, however, profoundly worried that she lacks the qualifications or judgments to be DNI. The job of the Director of National Intelligence is not a duty to be taken lightly. The incumbent serves as the principal intelligence advisor to the President and also bears the weight of responsibility to prevent another 9/11. The DNI must also represent the tens of thousands of intelligence professionals who around the world often toil in anonymity. They serve as America's first line of defense against terrorists, transnational criminals, and adversarial nations who wish to do us harm. And she must also represent America to our allies as a trustworthy partner. Unfortunately, through her own words and actions, Ms. Gabbard has demonstrated she is not up to the task. She took the word of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad against the assessments of our own Department of Defense, State Department, and intelligence community when she claimed that, and when she denied that Assad used chemical weapons against his own people. She knowingly met with a Syrian cleric who was vocally threatened to conduct serial bomb attacks against the United States. She sought to blame the United States and NATO, for Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. She publicly praised and defended Edward Snowden when he compromised our nation's most sensitive collection sources and methods, then ran off to hide in China and Russia. Those compromises put at risk not only our intelligence, but our men and women in uniform in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And just last week, even with repeated inquiries from her Republican colleagues, she refused to call Snowden a traitor. Now, speaking of China, when asked about TikTok at her confirmation hearing, she refused to acknowledge the threat posed by China owning a social media company that reaches 170 million Americans. And all the way up until she was nominated to be DNI, she publicly advocated for the wholesale elimination of FISA 702. 702 is a tool that we use actively in the intelligence domain, a tool that contributes literally 60% of the information that makes up the president's daily brief. That daily brief which will also fall under her responsibility should you be confirmed. The environment facing a new DNI today is complicated and fraught with challenges. Not only had the traditional threats persisted, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, but we've seen an increased threats from terrorism, cyber actions, and transnational criminal organizations. All the while, the intelligence community itself is under attack. Some of our most senior and experienced law enforcement and intelligence professionals are being asked to take political litmus tests. And those who are seen as insignificantly loyal are being fired or forced to resign. Whole agencies are being eliminated and funding impounded in flagrant defiance of the Constitution, which only gives the Congress, us here in this body, the power of the purse. And unvetted, unqualified individuals illegally burrowing into classified and sensitive information, this very action jeopardizing our national security and violating Americans' privacy. These Doge Bros seem to have no restriction on them at all, and I've seen no evidence that Ms. Gabbard is prepared to deal with this onslaught. Therefore, I must oppose her nomination and urge my colleagues to do the same.
Mr. President.
Senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. President. In a moment, the Senate will proceed to a cloture vote on the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. to be Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I rise to encourage my colleagues to support this motion. As Secretary of HHS, Mr. Kennedy would oversee our nation's expansive health care system, from sources of coverage to advancement of public health. Mr. Kennedy's decades of experience and deep drive to advocate on behalf of consumers will set a patient-centered tone at the department. As he has demonstrated in both public and private settings, Mr. Kennedy is committed to reorienting our healthcare approach and restoring faith in our institutions. His passion for addressing America's chronic disease epidemic will save lives, reduce costs, and establish a foundation for a healthier, stronger country. His dedication to transparency will empower patients to make more informed decisions about their health care and form a responsive rapport with Congress. As Mr. Kennedy stated during his hearing, if Congress asks me for information, you will get it immediately. Over the course of his vetting process, Mr. Kennedy met with dozens of members on both sides of the aisle, spoke with bipartisan Senate Finance Committee staff, appeared before 2 committee hearings, and answered over 900 questions for the record, not to mention presenting thousands of pages of documents. Mr. Kennedy has gone through the same Office of Government Ethics process as all nominees who come before the Finance Committee and has received support for his efforts. Similar to all other nominees, we have a letter from the Director of the Office of Government Ethics stating, based thereon, we believe that this nominee is in compliance with applicable laws and regulations governing conflicts of interest. He even amended his ethics agreement, going beyond what was required by the Office of Government Ethics in response to the request from one of our Finance Committee members. I urge my colleagues to join me in advancing this nomination so we can begin to make our country healthier. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Should I do it or not?
President,
Democratic leader.
I know I spoke a little while ago on Tulsi Gabbard, but I feel so strongly I just wanted to make one last plea to my Republican colleagues. In a moment, the Senate will vote to confirm Tulsi Gabbard as the next Director of National Intelligence. Every single Democrat, I am really proud to say, will oppose this awful nomination because we simply cannot, in good conscience, trust our most classified secrets to someone who echoes Russian propaganda and falls for conspiracy theories. It's hard to believe, of all the talented and capable people, that this is the person nominated. It's a person who has said things like the Ukraine invasion was caused by the United States, not by Putin. It's somebody who has denied Assad's use of chemical weapons despite all of the intelligence. It's someone who echoes Russian propaganda and falls for crazy conspiracy theories. I'd say to my Republican colleagues, please think once again about this nomination. This endangers our security. And my guess is, if a secret ballot were cast on Tulsi Gabbard, maybe she'd get 10 votes. You all know how bad she is. And so I know that people feel they want to please the president in his nomination. But there are certain times you have to buck and stand up and say, no, this is just a very bad choice for America. And the nomination of Ms. Gabbard is simply one of those. I plead with my colleagues, I know it's the last minute, to think twice, to vote no, as we all will vote, because this is such an awful nomination who will endanger our national security and our intelligence operations throughout the country and the world. I yield the floor. Absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Mr. President,
Senator from Oregon.
I rise to oppose the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be the
Senate quorum call.
vacate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to oppose the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to be the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. And let me put it very bluntly to my colleagues. A vote for Robert Kennedy for this position is a vote for a sicker America. And there's irony in that judgment, considering Mr. Kennedy is the figurehead of a mass movement known as Make America Healthy Again. But on issue after issue, Mr. Kennedy refused to stand up for policies that will keep Americans healthy and out of the hospital. From vaccines to affordable health insurance to lower drug prices to women's reproductive health care, Mr. Kennedy, through several hearings, ducked and dodged and weaved instead of answering the basic questions that came from senators of both parties. When he did answer, he demonstrated a shocking lack of knowledge about the federal health programs he'll be charged with running and a willful desire to mislead senators about his views on science matters like vaccine safety. The only conclusion I'm left with is that he stands steadfastly by the outlandish views he's expressed over his two-decade career as an anti-vaccine crusader, and he's fully prepared to implement the Republican health care agenda. That agenda boils down to putting big pharma and insurance companies back in charge while leaving millions of American families to fend for themselves without affordable care. And I want to be clear about this. Going back to my days as director of the Gray Panthers, which is what I did before I went into public service, I can just tell you, Mr. President, this is the least qualified nominee to ever be nominated for a position of this importance. So for the next day and night, Senate Democrats are going to be out on this floor telling the American people why. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle still have an opportunity to turn away from a dangerous path. If they do not, my view is their legacy will be tarnished by setbacks in science that will echo in America for decades. As I mentioned, I spent countless hours as a young man working with seniors to navigate the newly created Medicare program and help them avoid predatory insurance company tactics that remain all too common today. To me and many other Americans, healthcare colleagues is the most important issue, because if you and your loved ones don't have their health, everything else goes by the board. And the reality is, we need to make sure that Americans have the best and most affordable health care possible, rather than having a handful of health care companies being gobbled up in the entire market for health insurance, pharmaceuticals, hospitals, and even doctors. The results have been great for shareholder profits and disastrous for American families. Costs keep climbing. The act of getting a doctor's appointment or filing an insurance claim seems to have become an Olympic sport in much of America. The system delays and denies care and rakes in profits while patients are left wondering how they're going to get the care they need. So the question before the Senate now is whether we want America's chief health officer to be somebody who's going to take on those corporate interests, somebody who's going to fight tooth and nail to lower costs and improve care, somebody who's going to work to protect and improve the federal health care programs that tens of millions of Americans rely on them, and not gut. Everything I've seen and heard from Mr. Kennedy over these last few weeks has led me, colleagues, to conclude he is not the person that America needs. Americans have little reason to take Mr. Kennedy at his word. They do, however, have every reason to believe Mr. Kennedy will continue to embrace and amplify anti-vaccine programs. Every reason to believe is he will back up Donald Trump's abortion bans, and every reason exists to examine the prospect that he'll be a rubber stamp for the Republican health agenda that would rip away the health care of so many Americans. Over the next 24 hours, Democrats are going to show the American people why these concerns are so serious. I yield the floor, and I urge my colleagues to oppose this nomination.
Right now. All time has expired. The question occurs on the Gabbard nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Brett. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran,
Jim, are you still going back and forth every day?
No, I spent my last night here, and
Mr. Moreno,
back and forth enough,
Mr. Mullen,
too much.
Ms. Markowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders,
I don't want to hear it. Come over here, I'll tell y'all about it.
Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Blackburn, Britt, Budd, Cassidy, Cotton, Crapo, Curtis, Daines, Grassley, Johnson, Justice, Lankford, Moran, Mullen, Risch, Rounds, Schmidt, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy, Tillis, Tuberville. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Also Brooks, Coons, Hassan, Heinrich, Kim, Klobuchar, Lujan, Murray, Peters, Schumer, Shaheen, Van Hollen, Wyden. Mr. McCormick, aye. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, no. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mrs. Moody. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Husted. Mr. Husted, aye. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin, no. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Fetterman, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Moreno, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Kane, no. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Young, aye. Ms. Murkowski, Aye. Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bennett. No.
Like a fine enough state.
Mr. Hawley, Mr. Hawley. Aye.
Okay. Yeas are 52, nays are 48. Nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered, made, and laid upon the table, and the President will immediately notify of the Senate's actions.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I move to waive the mandatory quorum with respect to the Kennedy nomination.
Is there objection? Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. of California to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. A quorum is present. The question... What you want to do? The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. of California to be Secretary of Health and Human Services shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso.
Aye.
Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Thank you. Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Thank you. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Ono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. I did not, thank you. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane.
No, yes.
Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford. Thanks. Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Banks, Barrasso, Capito, Kramer, Curtis, Fisher, Haggerty, Hawley, Husted, Justice, Kennedy, Lee, McConnell, McCormick, Moran, Moreno, Mullen, Murkowski, Paul, Ricketts, Scott of Florida, Sheehy, Thune, Tillis, and Tuberville. Ms. Collins, aye. Senators voting in the negative. Thank you. Also Brooks, Bennett, Blunt Rochester, Booker, Coons, Durbin, Fetterman, Gallego, Hassan, Heinrich, Kane, Kim, Lujan, Reed, Rosen, Schatz, Shaheen, Slotkin, and Smith. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Ms. Duckworth, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Peters, no. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mrs. Britt, aye. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Kelly, no. Mrs. Moody, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Thank you. Mr. Schumer, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Ms. Hirono, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Department of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. of California to be Secretary.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon, sorry.
Mr. President, as we begin this discussion that is so important to America, I thought I would just mention the conversation I had recently with a couple of young medical students who came up to me and said, you know, we know you're interested in health care and have been involved in this, and I'm so appreciative of Senator Murray, who's going to pick up on the health care issue, an area where she has very substantial experience and expertise. And I thought these medical students summed up this debate, because they said, the way we see this Kennedy nomination, it's not just a vote for next week or even next year. This is a vote with enormous impact for decades, because Mr. Kennedy, according to these young students, these young medical students, has a long record of essentially being anti-science. And what we're going to do in our discussion of his nomination is go into that and other issues. And suffice it to say, during his confirmation hearings, and they've been in multiple committees now, he was given ample opportunity from members on both sides of the dais to clarify his views on science and vaccines and our nation's biggest federal health programs. And we're going to, in the hours ahead, touch on each of these and why Mr. Kennedy's failure to demonstrate a basic understanding of these important issues that impact America's health make him a uniquely unqualified nominee to become our nation's chief health care officer. And in beginning my remarks, Mr. President, I wanted to say that ever since my days with the Gray Panthers, I've always felt that health care is the most important issue. If you and your loved ones don't have your health, everything just goes by the board. So that just reinforces what these young medical students were saying about the decision we're going to make in future hours with respect to Mr. Kennedy. And I'm going to start with perhaps the most dangerous aspect of his long history, and that's his embrace and amplification of vaccine conspiracy theories. He's made a lucrative career out of sowing doubt in the minds of parents when it comes to vaccinating their kids. His, quote, nonprofit, the Children's Health Defense, is solely dedicated to peddling these conspiracies. You can even get merch. There are baby onesies, apparently, that read unvaxxed, unafraid, no vax, no problem. He's been the attorney of record on at least 5 cases against drug companies for their vaccines, which he didn't disclose to ethics officials and refused to answer questions about. He also refused to give up his 10% stake in any settlement agreements, instead passing them off to his son. And he refused to recuse himself from taking any actions that might affect his family's financial interest. A vaccine that has become routine for young people about 20 years ago is involved here, and since then, it's successfully cut cervical cancer rates into just a fraction of what they were before the drug came to market. All of this adds up to a future HHS secretary who stands to profit off undermining this vaccine and, as a result, raise cervical cancer rates. To quote my Republican colleague, Senator Cassidy, a physician, Mr. Kennedy is financially vested in finding fault with vaccines. He also played a big role in one of the most deadly measles outbreaks in recent history. In 2019, he traveled to Samoa and used his platform to promote his anti-vax agenda, taking aim at the measles vaccine. The vaccine rate in Samoa plummeted. By 2019, measles had torn through the entire population, making more than 5,700 people sick, and 80 people were killed, most of them young kids. During his confirmation hearing at the Senate Finance Committee, Mr. Kennedy told me, and I quote, "We don't know what was killing them," speaking about those 83 deaths. But just last week, the Director General of the Health of Samoa called this claim by Mr. Kennedy, and I quote here, "a total fabrication." So, Mr. President and colleagues, just put that in your thinking about this consideration. Mr. Kennedy saying that he didn't know what was killing these young people in Samoa, and the Director General of the Health of Samoa called Mr. Kennedy's claim a total fabrication. A recent analysis showed that Mr. Kennedy has made 114 separate appearances in the last 4 years where he took anti-vaccine views or spread misinformation about the efficacy of the vaccines. In 36 of these instances, Mr. Kennedy directly linked vaccines to autism. Instead of providing the committee with clarity or reassurances about his decades-long career peddling of vaccine conspiracies, what did Mr. Kennedy do? He dodged, he weaved, he bobbed, and gave no indication that as Health and Human Services Secretary, he would stand by settled science that surrounds vaccines. As HHS Secretary, Mr. Kennedy would have a huge amount of control over how vaccines are promoted and administered in our country. He could issue orders that discourage doctors from sharing information with parents and patients about life-saving vaccines. He could issue an order that discourages schools from talking about or even requiring vaccines. He could rubber stamp an executive order from Donald Trump that defunds the Centers for Disease Control, which is essentially the agency in charge of getting Americans up-to-date information about vaccines and when to get them. Just imagine you're a parent scrolling on Instagram or listening to a podcast. You hear this gentleman speaking passionately about the danger of vaccines. Maybe you do a bit of research, and lo and behold, you find this is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, America's chief healthcare guy. You think to yourself, This guy must know what he's talking about. Maybe he's right when he's questioning if vaccines are safe and effective. So the seed of doubt on vaccines gets planted. And then at your kid's next wellness exam, you decide not to get them their next round of vaccinations. A few months later, you're taking them on a trip to Disneyland, say for spring break, where countless other parents like you have heard the same medical advice from the same person, and you too decided against vaccinating your kids. It only takes one of those kids carrying a deadly disease like measles for an outbreak to begin. And pretty soon, after what was supposed to be the spring break trip of your dreams, your kid, sadly, is showing symptoms. What follows then is a slew of doctor's appointments, maybe even a stay in the hospital, sleepless nights, missed days of work and school, not to mention dread and fear for your child's very well-being. Meanwhile, countless other parents around the country that went on the same trip to Disneyland are now experiencing the same exact nightmare you are. Sowing the seed of doubt in the minds of just a few people can have massive consequences for communities across the country. And it is not hypothetical. Right now, there's a measles outbreak in Texas that sickened more than a dozen kids. The number of kindergartners showing up with an exemption for required vaccinations jumped to a record high last fall. The two facts are connected, and Mr. Kennedy and his allies can take the credit for it. Now, Mr. Kennedy is fond of saying he's not making recommendations about whether parents should vaccinate their kids. He's just asking questions and giving people choices. That's a slippery tactic used by conspiracy theorists to dodge any real responsibility for their words and actions, and it's absurd coming from somebody who's about to be confirmed for a job that is entirely about making recommendations. Mr. Kennedy is also fond of saying that if somebody shows him the science to prove he's wrong, well, then he'll apologize and retract his statements. But when somebody does show him the science proves him wrong, he just brushes it aside and basically will not accept it as fact. Once again, to quote my Republican colleague Bill Cassidy directly, to improve the health of Americans or undermine it, always asking for more evidence and never accepting the evidence that's there. That's why Bill Cassidy told Mr. Kennedy he was struggling with his nomination. So even Republicans like Senator Cassidy, someone I work with frequently on the Finance Committee and respect his opinion, he knows how dangerous this guy is. And it is not hyperbole to say that when Mr. Kennedy becomes Health and Human Services Secretary, if he does, and has control over how our government rolls out vaccines or make them available, I believe kids in America will die. And when disease rates for illnesses that have effective vaccines start to rise in states across the country, and hospitalizations and death tolls mount, my Republican colleagues are going to regret voting, if they do, for Mr. Kennedy today or early this morning. And when disease rates for illnesses that have effective vaccines start to rise in states across the country and death tolls, mount, again, we will see Republicans say, this is something that could have been prevented. What else should we have done? Republicans will be responsible for every child that dies as a result of not being vaccinated because it seems they care more about staying in the good graces of Donald Trump than they do about protecting the lives of kids. Again, this is something they will regret for years to come. Now, before we turn to Senator Murray's remarks, I'd just like to touch on Mr. Kennedy's stance on reproductive choice, an area where Senator Murray has been our leader for years and years in the Senate. In the lead up to and during his failed presidential campaign, Mr. Kennedy repeatedly claimed he supported a woman's right to make her own health care decisions. Less than a year ago, in an Instagram post on June 14th last year, he stated that he supports the emerging consensus in this country that abortion should be legal up to a certain number of weeks. Fast forward to his confirmation again at the Senate Finance Committee a few weeks ago. He was pressed repeatedly by Democrats about his stance on abortion. Instead of clarifying, Mr. Kennedy defaulted to a clearly rehearsed talking point that he repeated over and over again. Quote, I agree with President Trump. Every abortion is a tragedy. While that answer doesn't give us much clarity, it's certainly telling. Mr. Kennedy has a long history of changing his stance on healthcare issue after healthcare issue to whatever position benefits him at the moment.